Although God tried to fulfill his promises to the Israelites and bring them into the Canaan land, the people refused to enter because of their lack of faith and their fear of the people in the land. Consequently, all the people who were 20 years old and above were going to die in the wilderness, except for Joshua and Caleb, during a span of 40 years. Now, we will watch as this happens, and the younger generation is prepared to enter the land. So let's continue as we continue in the book of Numbers here. We notice Israel complains. Now, there have already been many times the unfaithful generation of the Israelites have complained during their time in the wilderness after leaving Egypt, and we've seen that. But this continued even more. As the biblical record advances in time to the 40th year after the Israelites left Egypt, they traveled to the wilderness of Zin, that is to Kadesh. Numbers chapter 20 and in verse 1 tells us that the entire Israelite community entered the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and they settled in Kadesh. And Miriam died and was buried there. So Moses and Aaron's sister. You can also go and read chapter 33, verses 36 through 38 to get a little more context for when this is happening. Here, the Israelites assembled against Moses and Aaron, complaining about the land and complaining about the lack of water. Let's continue reading here in verses 2 through 5. It says, "There was no water for the community, so they assembled against Moses and Aaron. The people quarreled with Moses and said, 'If only we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the Lord's assembly into this wilderness for us and our livestock to die here? Why have you led us up from Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It's not a place of grain, figs, vines, and pomegranates, and there is no water to drink.'" Look at the complaining again, and always wanting to go back to Egypt, thinking that was so much better. In response, God told Moses and Aaron to assemble the community and speak to the rock while the people watch, and water would be provided. Look at verse 8. "Take the staff and assemble the community. You and your brother Aaron are to speak to the rock while they watch, and it will yield its water. You will bring out water for them from the rock and provide drink for the community and their livestock." But yet, Moses and Aaron even did not honor God, and they were disobedient by striking the rock. Look in verses 9 through 11 of this chapter. "So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he had commanded him. Moses and Aaron summoned the assembly in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, 'Listen, you rebels. Must we bring water out of this rock for you?' Then Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with his staff, so that abundant water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank." Notice the error that they were guilty of. Instead of speaking to the rock, they struck the rock, but also failing to honor God, saying, "Must we bring water out of this rock?" It was God who was doing it. Consequently, God told them they were not going to lead the people into the land. Verses 12 and 13. "But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, 'Because you did not trust me to demonstrate my holiness in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this assembly into the land I have given them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord, and he demonstrated his holiness to them.'" Moses and Aaron, for all they have done, but yet they're not coming into the land either because of their error, because of their sin. Aaron, we see later, died on Mount Hor, and his son Eleazar became the high priest in his place. You can read chapter 20, verses 22 through 29. Well, then after leaving Mount Hor, the people again became impatient, and they complained against God and Moses concerning their conditions in the wilderness. Chapter 21, verses 4 and 5. Then they set out from Mount Hor by way of the Red Sea to bypass the land of Edom. But the people became impatient because of the journey. The people spoke against God and Moses. "Why have you led us up from Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread or water, and we detest this wretched food." Look at their displeasure. Again, complaining, not trusting. And therefore God sent burning or fiery or poisonous snakes among them, and many of the people died. Verse 6. Then the Lord sent poisonous snakes among the people, and they bit them, so that many Israelites died. When they confessed their sin, and Moses interceded for them, Moses was to make a bronze snake image mounted on a pole so that people could look at it, and anyone who was bitten could look at it and then recover. Look in chapter 21, verses 7 through 9. The people then came to Moses and said, "We have sinned by speaking against the Lord and against you. Intercede with the Lord so that he will tell the snakes, or take the snakes away from us." And Moses interceded for the people. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake image and mount it on a pole. When anyone who is bitten looks at it, he will recover." So Moses made a bronze snake and mounted it on a pole. When someone was bitten and he looked at it, at the bronze snake, he recovered. So again, you just recognize here's God's provision he makes for the people, even though they had sinned, they had rebelled once again. And so you see, as so often we have seen, a history of complaining against the Lord concerning their conditions. Next, let's move into a section that we see that Israel defeats Amorite kings. As Israel continued traveling, King Sihon of the Amorites refused to allow Israel to travel through their land, and even gathered his army to confront and fight against them. Let's look in Numbers chapter 21, verses 21 through 23. Israel sent messengers ahead of King Sihon Israel sent messengers to say to King Sihon of the Amorites, "Let us travel through your land. We won't go into the fields or vineyards. We won't drink any well water. We will travel the king's highway until we have traveled through your territory." But Sihon would not let Israel travel through his territory. Instead, he gathered his whole army and went out to confront Israel in the wilderness. When he came to Jahaz, he fought against Israel. So here's a battle that Israel finds themselves in. However, what we find happening is that Israel defeated them, and they took possession of their land. And this is going to be crucial as we keep moving forward in the Bible story. Let's look in verses 24 through 26. Israel struck him with the sword and took possession of his land from the Arnon to the Jabbok, but only up to the Ammonite border because it was fortified. Israel took all the cities and lived in all these Amorite cities, including Heshbon and all its surrounding villages. Heshbon was the city of King Sihon of the Amorites, who had fought against the former king of Moab and had taken control of all his land as far as the Arnon. And then if you look at verses 31 through 32, so Israel lived in the Amorites' land. After Moses sent spies to Jazer, Israel captured its surrounding villages and drove out the Amorites who were there. And so God has provided this victory for Israel over this king Sihon of the Amorites. And after this, they also went to Bashan, and King Og came against them to fight Israel with his army, if you look in verse 33. Then they turned and went up the road to Bashan, and King Og of Bashan came out against them with his whole army to do battle at Edrei. However, we also see that Israel defeated them by the Lord's power and took possession of their land. Verses 34 and 35. It says, "But the Lord said to Moses, 'Do not fear him, for I have handed him over to you along with his whole army and his land. Do to him as you did to King Sihon of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon.' So they struck him, his sons, and his whole army, until no one was left, and they took possession of his land." So again, they defeat this king in this land as well. But I want you to notice that while the people had previously been afraid of entering the land to fight against the people, remember back, right, because of their well-fortified cities and their strong armies and their giants, etc. If you go back to chapter 13 and you look at verse 28 and verses 32 and 33, they're afraid to go against the people of the land at that time. But God had now delivered these into their hands. They haven't come across the Jordan into the promised land yet, but on this side of the Jordan, he's kind of getting them ready, and they're having this victory, or these couple or series of victories against these two kings. And even King Og appears to have been a giant, as in Deuteronomy 3 and verse 11, it talks about his bed being something like 13 and a half feet long, somewhere in that range. And so now God's leading them to victory over the peoples of the land. So, Israel has had these victories over the Amorite kings, and now let's spend some time thinking about Israel's encounters with the Moabites as we continue in the story. So after defeating these Amorite kings, what we see happening is that Israel traveled and camped on the plains of Moab, near the Jordan River, across from Jericho. Numbers 22 and verse 1. We're going to see some significance as we keep going on in this story about Jericho, and that'll come into focus more as we come into the book of Joshua. But what we see is that King Balak of Moab, with some Midianites, had been informed of all that Israel had done, and they were terrified. Numbers chapter 22, verses 2 through 4 give us that picture. Again, you think about all that God had done in delivering Israel over these other kings. And now this king of Moab, King Balak, he's heard about this. And now the Israelites are on his doorstep, and he's terrified about it. And so consequently, he sent messengers to Balaam so that he would put a curse on the Israelites. Let's read in Numbers chapter 22, let's read verses 1 through 6. The Israelites traveled on and camped in the plains of Moab near the Jordan, across from Jericho. Now Balak, son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. Moab was terrified of the people, because they were numerous, and Moab dreaded the Israelites. So the Moabites said to the elders of Midian, "This horde will devour everything around us, like an ox eats up the green plants of the field." Since Balak, son of Zippor, was Moab's king at the time, he sent messengers to Balaam, son of Beor, at Pethor, which is by the Euphrates, in the land of his people. Balak said to him, "Look, a people has come out of Egypt. They cover the surface of the land and are living right across from me. Please put a curse on these people for me, because they are more powerful than I am. I may be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land, for I know that those you bless are blessed and those you curse are cursed. So this king, he's heard about these people, and then here they are on his doorstep, and they're so numerous, and they're going to devour the resources of the land, and he wants to defeat them. But he wants Balaam to put a curse on them. Balaam's called a diviner in Joshua 13, verse 22. We're not told a whole lot about this man and such. We're going to fill in some details as we go along. But as the story progresses, you find out that God revealed to Balaam he was not to go to Balak or put a curse on the people. Numbers 22, verses 12 and 13. Then God said to Balaam, "You are not to go with them. You are not to curse this people, for they are blessed." So Balaam got up the next morning and said to Balak's officials, "Go back to your land, because the Lord has refused to let me go with you." Balak, however, we find was insistent and promised Balaam a great reward for cursing Israel. Look at Numbers 22, verses 15 through 17. Balak sent officials again who were more numerous and higher in rank than the others. They came to Balaam and said to him, "This is what Balak, son of Zippor, says. Let nothing keep you from coming to me, for I will greatly honor you and do whatever you ask me. So please come and put a curse on these people for me." So Balak's going to honor Balaam in great ways if you'll just do this. Now, although Balaam would only do what God said, we do see, and he indicates that in chapter 22, verses 18 and 19, but he did not accept God's original answer. Look at verses 18 and 19. Balaam responded to the servants of Balak, "If Balak were to give me his house full of silver and gold, I could not go against the command of the Lord my God to do anything small or great. Please stay here overnight as the others did, so that I may find out what else the Lord has to tell me." Now, God had already told him the answer, and I think we need to remember that whenever we go on and think more about this story. God's already answered him, but now he wants to know more. And you can already see that though he's only doing what God says, that he wants to put a curse on Israel. He wants this glory and the promises that the king has made to him. Well, this time God allowed him to go, but God was angry with him. Verse 20, God came to Balaam at night and said to him, "Since these men have come to summon you, get up and go with them, but you must only do what I tell you." Verse 22, but God was incensed that Balaam was going, and the angel of the Lord took his stand on the path to oppose him. Balaam was riding his donkey, and his 2 servants were with him. So God's angry with him. He wouldn't accept his answer. And so God lets him go, and God puts this angel to oppose him. But God allowed this donkey to see the angel in his path. And if not for that donkey saving him from the angel and taking evasive actions on 3 occasions, God would have destroyed Balaam. You read about that through verses 22 through 35, and quite an interesting story. In fact, as God even opens the donkey's mouth so that he can talk to Balaam and then allows Balaam to see the situation. Well, then, when Balaam arrived, God used him to bless Israel rather than curse them on 4 occasions. And you can see Balak, and he keeps trying to get Balaam to curse Israel, and kind of takes him to different places. But each time, God's word comes to him, and he blesses Israel instead of puts a curse on them. Well, after this, the text records that Israel began prostituting themselves with the women of Moab and involving themselves in the sacrifices for their gods, aligning themselves with Baal of Peor and angering God. Look at Numbers 25, verses 1 through 3. It says, while Israel was staying in the acacia grove, the people began to prostitute themselves with the women of Moab. The women invited them to the sacrifices for their gods, and the people ate and bowed in worship to their gods. So Israel aligned itself with Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against Israel. Again, you can just see how there's a situation here, and you've got some unfaithfulness in Israel. Not following the true God, following this other God, which then allowed for this immorality to also take place. Well, God commanded Moses to execute the leaders of the people and to kill each of the men who were guilty. Verses 4 and 5, the Lord said to Moses, "Take all the leaders of the people and execute them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that his burning anger may turn away from Israel." So Moses told Israel's judges, "Kill each of the men who aligned themselves with Baal of Peor." And then we find that the total of those killed in the plague was about 24,000, chapter 25, verses 6 through 13. But later, one of the interesting things that we discover is that Balaam was behind this incident, presumably to provoke God to curse the people of Israel so he could receive honor from Balak. In chapter 31 and verse 16, it talks about how these were the ones who, at Balaam's advice, incited the Israelites to unfaithfulness against the Lord in the Peor incident, so that the plague came against the Lord's community. So while Balaam would only do what God said, and Balaam would not curse the people if God blessed them, but yet Balaam is behind the scenes giving advice to set a trap to bring about the Lord's wrath upon the people. Well, after dealing with Israel's unfaithfulness, God then led the rest of the Israelites in victory over Moab and Midian. Chapter 25, verses 16 through 18. The Lord told Moses, "Attack the Midianites and strike them dead, for they attacked you with the treachery that they used against you in the Peor incident. They did the same in the case involving their sister Cosbi, daughter of the Midianite leader who was killed the day the plague came at Peor." And then in chapter 31, verses 1 and 2, the Lord spoke to Moses, "Execute vengeance for the Israelites against the Midianites. After that, you will be gathered to your people." In verses 7 through 11, they waged war against Midian, as the Lord had commanded Moses, and killed every male. Along with the others slain by them, they killed the Midianite kings, Evi, Rechem, Zor, Hur, and Reba, the 5 kings of Midian. They also killed Balaam, son of Beor, with the sword. The Israelites took the Midianite women and their dependents captive, and they plundered all their cattle, flocks, and property. Then they burned all the cities where the Midianites lived, as well as all their encampments. And they took away all the spoils of war and the captives, both people and animals. So God brings again his people to victory. But then one other thing for us to look at in this lesson are some preparations and Transjordan settlements that were identified here in this reading as well. So after the plague on Israel due to this incident, Moses and Eleazar were instructed to take another census of Israelite men who could serve in the army, those 20 years old and above. And you read about that in Numbers 26, verses 1 and 2. After the plague, the Lord said to Moses and Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest, "Take a census of the entire Israelite community by their ancestral families of those 20 years old or more who can serve in Israel's army." None were left of those who had rebelled since the last census. Chapter 26, verses 63 through 65, these were the ones registered by Moses and the priest Eleazar when they registered the Israelites on the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho. But among them was not one of those who had been registered by Moses and the priest Aaron when they registered the Israelites in the wilderness of Sinai. For the Lord had said to them that they would all die in the wilderness. None of them was left except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, son of Nun. The total number was now 601,730 of these fighting-aged men. Levites were then counted separately. Larger tribes, we find, would receive a larger land allotment in the Promised Land than smaller ones. And later, Joshua is also identified as the one who would lead Israel after Moses' death in chapter 27, verses 18 through 23. The Lord replied to Moses, "Take Joshua, son of Nun, a man who has the Spirit in him, and lay your hands on him. Have him stand before the priest Eleazar and the whole community and commission him in their sight. Confer some of your authority on him, so that the entire Israelite community will obey him. He will stand before the priest Eleazar, who will consult the Lord for him with the decision of the Urim. He and all the Israelites with him, even the entire community, will go out and come back in at his command." Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He took Joshua, had him stand before the priest Eleazar, and the entire community laid their hands on him and commissioned him as the Lord had spoken through Moses. So Joshua is going to be the one, because Moses is not coming into the land. Joshua now is the one who's going to lead the people. Additional instructions were also given concerning offerings and vows. And then we see that the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh received permission to take their land allotment on the east of the Jordan River and the land that had been conquered. Look in chapter 32, verses 1 through 5. The Reubenites and Gadites had a very large number of livestock. When they surveyed the lands of Jazer and Gilead, they saw that the region was a good one for livestock. So the Gadites and Reubenites came to Moses, the priest Eleazar, and the leaders of the community, and said, "The territory of Adaroth, Dibon, Jazer, Nimrah, Heshbon, Eliah, Sebam, Nebo, and Beon, which the Lord struck down before the community of Israel, is good land for livestock, and your servants own livestock." They said, "If we have found favor with you, let this land be given to your servants as a possession. Don't make us cross the Jordan." Verse 33, so Moses gave them, the Gadites, Reubenites, and half the tribe of Manasseh, son of Joseph, the kingdom of King Sihon of the Amorites, and the kingdom of King Og of Bashan, the land including its cities with the territories surrounding them. And so this land was given to them, provided, though, that the men would still go fight with the rest of the Israelites to help them take the promised land. They couldn't just have theirs now and then not go help the rest. Chapter 32, verses 20 through 27 details that. And so they agreed to that, and thus the land was given to them. And their descendants their dependents could stay behind with their flocks, but they would still have to go into the land to fight. Well, then, as we close, the generation of Israelites that had been above 20 years old when they left Egypt had now died during the 40 years that had passed. Now the younger generation had grown and taken some land as an inheritance. Moses, however, will not lead them across the Jordan into the land God had promised. Yet we will watch as he works to prepare them for this time.